Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and we're just about to start the Film Stories podcast.
6, 5, main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, booster ignition and...
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're certainly films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is as pure a celebration of cinema as I can possibly make it. Without further ado, I'm going to get on with the first of the two films I want to talk about in this episode. And for the first time in the near 4-year history of Film Stories, we're going to do a bit of Christopher Nolan. Here's a clip, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Little late, Coop.
Yeah, we had a flash.
It's an Indian surveillance drone. Solar cells power an entire farm.
What'd you do, Murph?
She didn't do nothing.
Murphy's Law.
You're a well-educated man, Coop, and a trained pilot.
And an engineer.
The world doesn't need any more engineers. We didn't run out of planes and television sets. We ran out of food.
Dad, why did you name me after something that's bad?
Oh, we didn't.
Murphy's Law.
Murphy's Law doesn't mean that something bad will happen. It means that whatever can happen will happen.
We must confront the reality that nothing in our solar system can help us.
Yeah, there's the mighty Sir Michael Caine just cheering us all up at the end there. And that's a clip from the trailer from 2014's Interstellar, directed by Christopher Nolan, written by Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan, starring Matthew McConaughey, Anne Hathaway, Jessica Chastain, Bill Irwin, Ellen Burstyn and Michael Caine. And Interstellar is a story that, if you take it back to its absolute grassroots, started, well, as the tale goes, with a blind date. Now, on one side of the date was movie producer, author, and one-time guest on this podcast, producer Linda Obst, author of, her movie books are terrific. I hugely recommend them. And she's produced films as broad and as wide as Adventures in Babysitting, Contact, The Siege, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, Angus Thongs and Perfect Snogging, and The Fisher King. Now, so she was on one side of the blind date, and on the other was astrophysicist Kip Thorne. And this was reported by Wired magazine as taking place in the 1980s. It had been set up by the author Carl Sagan, who wrote Contact, and Obst would go on to produce the film of that. And the sum total of the blind date was that Linda Obst and Kip Thorne would become friends and ongoing friends as well. And so it was towards the back end of the 2000s that the pair of them, who'd stayed in touch, started thinking about a film that involved the properties of black holes and wormholes. And they were both really interested and engaged in this. And between the pair of them, they fashioned an 8-page treatment for the story, outlining what they thought it should be. And that treatment was enough to interest none other than Steven Spielberg. Now, Spielberg at this point, so we're in the mid to late 2000s, was still at his DreamWorks SKG studio, where he was basing the majority of his filmmaking. And the project that would become Interstellar was signed up by the studio for development formally in 2006. Now, move forward to January of 2007, and the project appears to have some legs because Jonathan Nolan, the brother of Christopher, the latter of whom at that point was in production on a film called The Dark Knight, was hired to pen a screenplay for Interstellar. And as he told the Los Angeles Times in March of 2007, he said, "I have a better understanding of what those NASA astronauts feel like as they're about to get blasted off into outer space when I was waiting to go to pitch ideas to Linda Obst and Steven Spielberg." Now, Interstellar is a film that involves outer space exploration. And as Nolan would describe of his pitch meeting, which had taken place at the start of 2007, he said, "I'm not even sure if I remember what I told them, but they must have liked something," and he admitted it was a pretty intense experience. Now, Jonathan Nolan had been one of the catalysts and inspirations for Christopher Nolan's breakthrough film, Memento. He was also a writer on Batman Begins and The Dark Knight and was working closely with his brother. And Spielberg at this point had his close eye on Interstellar as a movie, as a possible director outing for him. So it's no secret that Spielberg's produced a lot of films, but also tends to juggle various different directorial options and see which bubbles to the top. Now, the one that was bubbling to the top at the time was a film called Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull that he was in the midst of making as the Interstellar script came together. And so Spielberg, I mean, he had his eye on this project. It was set up with DreamWorks' then production partners Paramount Pictures, and the idea was the pair would co-fund the movie, and it seemed like there was a path forward. And in fact, Entertainment Weekly around the time reported that the trio aspired to mount a realistic space exploration film for Paramount that was grounded in solid science, but also explored theoretical possibilities, black holes, wormholes, quantum physics, extra-dimensional space, the stuff you look up on Wikipedia to understand. And the trio, just to be clear, were Linda Obst, Jonathan Nolan and Steven Spielberg. But a couple of things happened that altered the course of this particular project. So firstly, in 2008, out came The Dark Knight, and it proved an absolute sensation, a box office breakthrough for Christopher Nolan as well. The first Batman film to smash through $1 billion at the box office. It would earn Oscar nomination. It would earn an Oscar, actually, for the late Heath Ledger as well. And then away from Christopher Nolan's success, which gave him the currency pretty much to make any film that he wanted, and he did, DreamWorks' deal with Paramount Pictures came to an end. Now, this was less of interest to us on the audience side of the fence, but it did mean a significant detour in the Interstellar story, because DreamWorks then opted to partner with Disney instead. And so Spielberg went with DreamWorks, but the Interstellar project stayed with Paramount. This meant Steven Spielberg could no longer realistically direct Interstellar, and so it needed a new director. Jonathan Nolan, wouldn't you know it, had an idea of just the man for the job. He'd been in constant communication with his brother about the film. They talked about their projects, and he put Christopher Nolan's name forward. Now, in 2010, Christopher Nolan's career, I mean, really, it went into the stratosphere. That, for better or worse, it was expected that a Batman movie would do good business, even though no one expected The Dark Knight really to do the level that it did, or to be as great as it is. But the follow-up film to that, Inception, which was I'm going to take this currency and make the film that no one would be mad enough to make, proved to be almost an equal-sized hit for Warner Brothers. And here was the thing, Christopher Nolan had proven not only could he direct an intelligent, non-franchise sci-fi movie aimed at an older audience, realistically, but it could turn into a monster hit as well. As such, when Jonathan put Christopher's name forward for Interstellar, I mean, he was just the logical choice. And Paramount Pictures, to say it was keen, would be no understatement. As Jonathan Nolan would explain to Entertainment Weekly around this time, he said, "My brother and I have this kind of symbiotic relationship." He said, "I always talk to him. So I've been trying out material with him from the beginning." And he said, "When you're a writer, you're always looking to see if your scripts pass the jealousy test. Like, damn, I wish I was doing that project." And Jonathan Nolan admitted, "I could tell Chris was interested." Well, he was interested, and this is explored quite a lot in Tom Schon's excellent book, The Nolan Variations, as well. But there was a condition of Christopher Nolan coming on board a film like this, and that was he was going to rewrite the script. And he told Jonathan this. Now, in particular, he wanted to transform the middle section that Jonathan Nolan had put together. As he would explain, he wanted to reshape the middle, the exploration of planets. He wanted to play with scale and pit man against monolithic nature, dust storms, tidal waves, and even the spoiler in the last act. These were all the things that came under the microscope of Christopher Nolan. He also changed the character of, it made an alteration to the lead character, Cooper, in that their child was now a girl rather than a boy. And the official word finally came through in January 2013, even though he'd been involved for a little while to that point, that Christopher Nolan was going to make Interstellar his next directorial project, and bringing, as usual, Emma Thomas along as his producer. So by the time he signed on the dotted line, Nolan had already gone back to Kip Thorne and spent some time with him, and Thorne would ultimately get an executive producer credit on the movie. And as Nolan would explain, it would be to kick around ideas about time, space, and the time-space continuum. And in the process of that, they explored questions about wormholes to whether it might actually be possible for a human being to go faster than the speed of light. Now, Jonathan Nolan had done a lot of heavy lifting in putting the script together in the first place. He would describe, he'd tell Empire that he'd been working on and off on Interstellar for some 4 years, and there were a lot of ideas in the screenplay, and Christopher Nolan needed to whittle all of that down. As Christopher Nolan would tell The Hollywood Reporter, it's confusing this, isn't it? He said, when I came to the project, Kip and Jonathan, had worked on a vast array of ideas involving a lot of different things you're talking about, and one of the most important parts of my job was to say, okay, we can't use all of this, I'm going to have to choose. And his criteria for choice was the things that, as a director, his words, I can get across to the audience and hopefully not lose them. This was going to be a dense film, and this was going to be quite a complex film to explain as well. And Nolan put in the groundwork. He went to NASA, he went off to the space base of a man called Elon Musk as part of his research as well. He would look at how the Apollo space missions of old didn't use the cutting edge technology of the time, but instead lent on tried and tested technology they could take into space. And also, he'd had in his head a different project that was thus far unnamed, that wasn't a million miles away from the subject matter. And so, as he told the Daily Beast, I combined it with that script I'd been working on for a number of years in the back of a filing cabinet, as it were, and I took it and ran with it. And that was where the script ultimately for Interstellar came along. This film was moving ahead. It was going to be costly, but who wouldn't stump up the money for a standalone Christopher Nolan film at this stage? And so casting came together. So Matthew McConaughey takes the lead role in this, one of the lead roles in this, and he described how he got a call when he was working on something else in New Orleans, and how he was called to Christopher Nolan's office, and so he flew over, and they talked for 3 hours, he said, but they just didn't mention the film once. And so McConaughey flew in, had this chat, they hadn't taught the movie, went home. And eventually, after that conversation, he was trusted with a copy of the screenplay for the movie, but also the screenplay for the movie came with a man. And the man's job was to wait until Matthew McConaughey had fully read the script. Now, McConaughey would explain that he's quite a slow reader of scripts. He likes to take his time. And as such, the man was outside his house or in his house. I don't know. I'd like to think Matthew McConaughey, while leaning, would make him a cup of tea. And so 5.5 hours later, he handed the script back, and the script was taken back to Christopher Nolan. Matthew McConaughey had a lot of questions and was duly announced to be joining the film in April 2013. And alongside him was Anne Hathaway, who had just shot The Dark Knight Rises with Christopher Nolan, which would come out in 2012. So there were the two leads. Hathaway at this point was coming off the back of her Oscar win for Les Miserables as well. And talk was already active at this point of a November 2014 release. Now, there's one other key hire worth bringing here, that Nolan would bring a lot of his regular collaborators back, but someone new was his cinematographer, who in this case was Hoyten van Hoytema, who joined after Wally Pfister, Nolan's regular cinematographer, went off to make a film of his own. He would direct the film Transcendence. Other than that, the personnel were familiar. Lee Smith would be coming back to edit the film. Hans Zimmer would be hired in to do the music, but the way that Nolan and Zimmer put together the music for Interstellar was different. That Nolan brought Zimmer in from day one, got him to compose stuff just based on a couple of notes rather than script. He wanted Hans Zimmer to just get the feeling of the film and put together some music, which Zimmer duly did. And while all that was going on, there were more shenanigans going on behind the scenes in corporate Hollywood. Because at this stage, Warner Brothers was the home of Christopher Nolan's projects. That Nolan's production company, Syncope, was set up on the Warner Brothers lot in Los Angeles. And going back to Insomnia, Batman Begins, Christopher Nolan films were made at Warner Brothers. It's only recently that has broken, as it happened. And so Warner Brothers wanted to buy into Interstellar. It wanted to be part of this, and it was willing to trade to do so. So Paramount Pictures it drove a hard bargain, really, in that it agreed to split the ownership of Interstellar and the distribution of Interstellar. But in return, Warner Brothers had to give Paramount time-limited rights to make a new Friday the 13th movie. That didn't work out too well. And also a stake in the next South Park movie to hit the big screen. That didn't quite go to plan either. But nonetheless, it was telling how important Christopher Nolan was to Warner Brothers that the studio was willing to trade rights to 2 projects just to get this one standalone film. With that deal inked, though, the 2 studios fronted up $160 million for the movie. It was not going to be cheap to make. And, it comes back to this was a standalone film at the point cinematic universes were rising. There was no chance of a sequel. And as much as Inception had done a lot of the pathfinding for selling this kind of film, this was nonetheless Christopher Nolan and his team, not for the first time, taking a bit of a leap into the unknown. So the official start of production on this one was August 6, 2013, with filming getting underway in Alberta, Canada. This was around the area where Nolan had shot certain sequences for Inception. And as is the norm with his films, we're seeing it at the moment with his currently filming movie Oppenheimer, which is coming out in 2023. There was a veil of secrecy and a half over this one. I mean, the code name for the film would be named after Nolan and Emma Thomas's daughter. It would be called Flora's Letter. And plot points were just not in public distribution, really. They were going to cover this up as much as they possibly could and keep it as secret as possible. Now, Nolan would again be shooting on film. He's hugely passionate about shooting on film, and some sequences in this case were shot on IMAX 70mm film. If you've not seen pictures of the size of IMAX 70mm film and the cameras required to shoot that material, it's well worth taking a look, because it just goes to the fact it's okay someone saying they're going to use that, but the logistical effort is quite something, especially when the movie was then going to remote parts of Iceland to shoot in the middle of water as well. I mean, this was a film, as with lots of Nolan movies, that was willing to travel around the world. It was also one that wore its inspirations on its sleeve. 2001: A Space Odyssey was regularly cited by Christopher Nolan during the promotion for the film, as well as his wide-eyed watching of Star Wars when it first came out in the late 70s, and his just desire to make his own science fiction movie. But also there was a Ken Burns documentary, The Dust Bowl, that would make its way actually directly into the film, because Burns agreed to allow Nolan to use outtake material from that. And there are sequences early in Interstellar, I'm going very spoiler light here, where the planet is under some degree of threat. There are dust clouds and there are vox pops from people talking about the world, and these were taken from a completely different production from material that Ken Burns had shot for his documentaries. Now, Kip Thorne was present on set throughout this. There was tangible scientific advice available to the actors whenever they wanted it, and the actors did take him up on that. But for Nolan, a man who always preferred the practical to the CG, this was a film where he didn't entirely get his own way on that. That there was a requirement for CG. This was a film about going into outer space, that going out into the unknown. But he still was looking for ways. How can he possibly ground that in reality? How can he build as much as possible and not rely on the computer? And so what they decided, and he used 1983's terrific film The Right Stuff as inspiration for this, was that they needed to build the interiors of the spaceship in the film. That what they were going to do is just build a massive set with the ship on it, and then put a computerized star field in the background of that, so that they weren't requiring effects directly on set. He didn't want to shoot it in front of a green screen, that he'd be able to have actors moving around something tangible. They'd be able to put the stars in the background, and in theory the whole thing would work. Now, there was, before we got to that point, a good chunk of that film of the film being shot in Iceland, as I mentioned, and that did require transportation, for instance, of a very sizable prop. You'll know which one if you've seen the film, to the country and putting it out into the water in the middle of nowhere. It also meant actors had to go into the water in the middle of nowhere as well. And I mean, one story with Anne Hathaway, I mean, it was already uncomfortable for actors just standing in freezing cold waters while Nolan tried to get his shots. But then her suit started leaking as well, her spacesuit. And a cold shoot suddenly got a whole lot colder because she started over the course, over a short period of time, to get symptoms of hypothermia. She alerted her director to that, and they quickly got the necessary footage in the can. Now, in the end, 45 days of the shoot would take place on sound stages in Los Angeles, specifically that Ranger spaceship capsule that was built life-size by production designer Nathan Crowley and his team. The starfield that was in the background of it was put on wraparound screens that were 80 feet in height, 300 feet in length. No green screen there at all. The actors were working in front of computerized starfields on the set. And then there's a lovely story about the cornfield sequences that were used in the movie, where Nolan tapped into the knowledge of a mate of his, Zack Snyder. Now, it was Christopher Nolan who recommended Zack Snyder to direct the Superman reboot, Man of Steel, and they were in touch. And one of the things in Man of Steel was that for the origins of Clark Kent and Superman in that movie, they needed a cornfield. And so Christopher Nolan asked Snyder how they went about it, and they realised that they could grow a couple of hundred acres for the film, and that's just what they did in the Calgary area in Canada. So even the cornfield you see in the movie is real. There's a little bit of computerized enhancement for certain little effects to do with it. But what I particularly love about this story is they planted 500 acres of corn that they used for the film. They had so much that they didn't need to damage or burn or whatever for the movie at the end, that they were able to sell it and make a profit on the corn. If Interstellar had lost money at the box office, it would have made a bit of profit on the agricultural side. Production would wrap up on the movie in December 2013. It came in under budget. In the end, I mean, they budgeted up to 175 million across the assorted studios involved in this. Nolan brought it in for 165 and then went into post-production with it with his regular editor, Lee Smith. And that's where they hit a problem, that Nolan would confess in Tom Sean's book that this was a really tricky film to edit and certainly a lot less straightforward than, say, for instance, his Batman films. Now, they certainly started off approaching the edit in the usual way. You assemble all your footage together, put together a rough cut, and then start to trim it down. And so what they were doing was they were gradually taking more of the spaces out of the picture. And Nolan noticed that as they were getting the film trimmed down and more focused on the dialogue and the story, it was making it more boring, of all things, that it wasn't quite working. And in order to kind of reset his head and have a look at a different way to do it, he and Lee Smith took a look at the very, very visual movie Keanu's Catzy, and it changed the way they approached the film, because what Nolan then appreciated was, as twee as it sounds, experiencing the movie was as important as the dialogue. There was something quite mesmeric about looking at open space on a cinema screen, having so much time to absorb all of that, and the kind of untold work that could do in setting the scene for the film and building the experience of it for the audience. And so they went back a little bit to square one on the edit of that, and the film started to get longer again as they made sure they put those moments back in, that it didn't just cut over and over again to the dialogue, and instead there was space, no pun intended, to explore outer space on screen, to take their time with it, to go back really to the principles of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, and to open up this world as a piece of cinema. Now, the imagery and scale of it had to come across. Nolan was absolutely adamant about that, and so he would admit this one was a slightly messier film to edit, and narratively a less straightforward film than some of his other movies, but he was happy with the direction it was going. Hans Zimmer came in, and his score for the film, which again done, the music begun with no script, no plot, and just a page of information of a little bit of story for him to work on. And it was all coming together. The visual effects were coming together, and the film was all set for release. It was premiering in October 2014, ahead of a release in early November 2014. Now, when we get to the second film in this episode of Film Stories, we're going to be talking about movie marketing again. I think Interstellar is, it features some of the finest movie marketing, really, of that particular decade. That it goes back to the principles that were established by Sue Kroll, who was heading up marketing at Warner Brothers when she promoted Inception and tried to sell this very grown-up adult movie, not like that, and managed to get basically the scale of it across, to sell Christopher Nolan as a brand name as well, really, although I think he would hate being described as that. And it was not dissimilar in that the trailers weren't giving an awful lot of the game away. The scale of it was coming over, but this was billed as a big Christopher Nolan science fiction movie, and that was really enough to get a lot of people interested in it, right up to the release of the movie. The secrets were being kept, and so it headed off in front of critics and before audiences, and the reception to this one was, I would say, very good rather than ecstatic. That this wasn't seen as an Inception equal, and it was also a film that does, and still does really, require a leap of faith from its audience to go with it. I don't so spoiler light on this, I can't tell you. Short of to say, there are decisions within Interstellar that I think most of us would at least would at least have a conversation about. How's that? And so Nolan knew this, of course. He knew what he was doing, and the audacity of the film certainly came across. The visual scope of it came across. There was some pushback on this. However, when it went before audiences, they were willing to turn up again to see a big Christopher Nolan movie on the big screen. It opened in the US with a $47.5 million opening weekend, that weekend of November the 7th to the 9th. Wasn't actually the number one movie in its opening weekend. Disney's Big Hero 6 opened that week as well. The other ones that were around in the top 10, well, there was Gone Girl from David Fincher. That had been hanging around 5 or 6 weeks. Ouija from Universal was in there. Fury, St. Vincent, Nightcrawler. What a film Nightcrawler is if you've not seen it. And the first John Wick was hanging around. But Interstellar, well, it made its mark, and the studios behind it could breathe out, and it hung around as well. It wasn't as big as Inception, it wasn't as big as Batman, but considering the nature of the film and the narrative of the film and the direction it goes in, the US gross of $188 million was not to be sniffed at. The overseas gross of $489, well, that was very tidy. In all, $677 million at the cinema box office, even more when it came to disc. And Interstellar is clearly a film that is going to be watched and revisited, and you'll be getting 20th anniversary box sets of it in, well, whenever the 20th birthday of it is. But it would also be remiss of me not to acknowledge there were complaints about this, because not for the first time, there were conversations that the dialogue in the movie was inaudible. Now, I found this before with Nolan's films. I found it with a sequence in Inception as well. But in the case of Interstellar, because the impact of the audio was prioritising the music so much over what people were saying, it got to the point where one cinema in New York infamously put up a sign to tell its patrons that its sound equipment was working. Now, Nolan would admit to Tom Shawn in the Nolan Variations book that this was a very deliberate move, and that he and his team had spent a long time getting the sound right. But it's the one thing that keeps coming up in an assortment of Nolan films, most recently in Tenet as well. I would imagine it will come up somewhere in his upcoming Oppenheimer 2. But also, I would be very surprised if the plot twists and the plot journey of Oppenheimer causes anywhere near as much as debate as certain moments in Interstellar. Interstellar stands alone, I would suggest, as one of the boldest big studio science fiction movies of that particular decade, and the kind of film that is breathtakingly hard to get through the studio system. In 2014, it was hard to get through the system. Now, I don't even know where you begin to start unless you were Christopher Nolan or James Cameron. Fortunately for Interstellar, one of the people involved with it was Christopher Nolan. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening. A few little notices just in the middle here. Firstly, if you like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it, and I'm grateful for any stroke all of these. I'm on Patreon, for instance, patreon.com/Simon Brew. And any money that you contribute there, it goes to resources to make the podcast. It goes to pay writers who are looking for a way into the industry. I try and give them writing work on the website, and that's funded by your Patreon donations as well. And other assorted bits and bobs that we're up to. In return, you get virtually all of the podcasts early. You get a few audio extras as well, and you find gossip on what we're up to. And there is stuff coming up, which I will be gossiping even about on Patreon very, very shortly. If you can subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously as well. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, all these things help independent podcasts like this enormously. We're all at the mercy of the algorithms and huge companies, and I appreciate all the support you give me. I am live again. I've got a live show coming up in Birmingham on Wednesday, the 18th of May, 2022. Tickets are on sale now. More details at filmstories.co.uk. And I'm in London for my first Film Stories live show in London is coming up in June of 2022. None of this is any use if you're catching up on this podcast, but you know, if you're looking, if you're in the future coming back at this, just know that you missed a cracking night. I mean, I've got to say that, really, haven't I? Enough plugs. I want to get on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. Again, let me play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
This is the tale of an ordinary man who had everything.
Barker, his name was. Benjamin Barker.
Until a man of power stole his freedom, destroyed his family, and banished him.
May the Lord have mercy on your soul.
For life. And in his sorrow, a new man was born.
15 years dreaming I might come home to a wife and child.
Benjamin Barker.
Not Barker. Sweeney Todd now. And he will have his revenge. Where's my wife?
She's gone. And he's got your daughter.
Judge Turpin.
You've got to leave this all behind you now.
No. These are desperate times. And desperate measures are called for.
Now, that is a longer than usual clip from a trailer to introduce a film. It's from Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street from 2007, directed by Tim Burton, screenplay by John Logan, based on the musical, crucial word there, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street by Stephen Sondheim and Hugh Wheeler, and a cast led by Johnny Depp, Helena Bonham Carter, Alan Rickman, Timothy Spall and Sacha Baron Cohen. What do you notice about that trailer, though? I mean, it's a famous story, this. You would have no idea from listening to that you were getting a promo for a musical. Hold that thought, because I'm coming back to that shortly. So it was back in 1979 that the late, great Stephen Sondheim debuted what would turn out to be one of his most enduring musicals, called Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Now, in turn, this was based on a 1973 play of the same name by Christopher Bond, and for the musical, Sondheim wrote the music and the lyrics for the macabre show, with Hugh Wheeler penning the book for it. It arrived on Broadway in 1979. It picked up Tony Awards. It had Angela Lansbury in its original cast. And it would run for 557 performances, closing in June 1980, but would prove to be one of Stephen Sondheim's most enduring shows. It's been revived many times. It's gone on tour many times. And when it, for the first time, made it to London, there was a student who happened to be visiting the city at the time who caught the show during its initial 5-month run in 1980. That young student was called Tim Burton, and the musical that he saw just stuck with him, just completely stuck in his head. And whilst at that point he was nowhere near being a film director, well, let's just say he would come back to this and come back to this fairly soon, because it was towards the back end of the 1980s that Tim Burton was emerging as a Hollywood director to be reckoned with, an unlikely one as well, but he turned the Pee Wee Herman film into a hit, and then 1988's Beetlejuice had seen him in turn confirmed as the director of Warner Brothers' 1989 big-budget Batman film, and within 3 films he'd gone to the top of the Hollywood wish list. And it was around this time that he approached Stephen Sondheim about doing a Sweeney Todd film. Now, Sondheim was always protective of the movie rights to his musicals. He wouldn't just do it for the sake of it. He had to be convinced that there was an argument that this could be done in an interesting way. And Sondheim was interested, and they had conversations, and Burton made notes and drawings. And then he got busy. Burton would find he would get enveloped in Batman. He would go straight on to do Edward Scissorhands straight after Batman. He'd make Batman Returns in 1992. And it's worth noting, Batman, Edward Scissorhands and Batman Returns were all released within a three-year space. An intense amount of work. And I mean, bluntly, Burton would have been knackered. So he put his notes and those drawings in a drawer. He moved on. And over time, Stephen Sondheim would resist many other offers for the film rights to Sweeney Todd. But the reputation of the show was just growing, if anything. And just because Tim Burton was no longer in the frame to direct it, it didn't mean other studios weren't. And one crucial turning point, really, was the film take on the musical Chicago that didn't just turn into a box office hit. It also won a Best Picture Oscar nomination. And Hollywood studios, when they see something succeed, then there's the stampede to copy it. What other musicals are around? What else can they do? And so then we moved to the early 2000s, where producers Walter F. Parks and Laurie MacDonald, well, they were working at the DreamWorks studio. They were heading up the live action slate at DreamWorks, and they figured this was their one chance to do a musical. They wanted to give a musical a go. They got in touch with Stephen Sondheim, and they convinced him, he was reluctant, to let them give it a go. And so by 2003, DreamWorks had acquired the film rights to make Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, as a movie. Because of the success of Chicago, and because the appetite really for it, the R rating wasn't going to be a massive concern. And so then in July 2003 came the news that a writer was on board, and that was John Logan, who, he'd enjoyed success penning Gladiator, and he was working on a fresh screenplay for the film version, a take that, and I'll come to this in a second, would cut out many of Stephen Sondheim's songs from the stage show. Now, Logan would work in conjunction with Sondheim across the 5 years he was associated with the film's production. And there was early casting talk for who would take on the role of Sweeney Todd. So Hugh Jackman then had broken through in X-Men in 2000, but also by the time he was a success in X-Men, he was a musical theatre star, and he seemed like a logical person to give it a go. But then Sam Mendes came aboard. Now, Sam Mendes, as a director, had, with his debut feature, won a Best Director Oscar, and that film was American Beauty, and it was he who helped bring John Logan onto the project and got into talks to direct and was interested in making the movie of this. Sam Mendes also has an extensive theatrical background. And so Mendes, when Hugh Jackman's casting wasn't really going anywhere, well, his version would then turn its attention to Russell Crowe as a possible lead. This was a long time before Les Miserables at this point. And so it looked like the film was going forward at that point, but there were ongoing frustrations with the casting. So Stephen Sondheim told Broadway World about how Mendes got involved, and he said how Mendes had done a production of Gypsy, the musical Gypsy, in New York City, and he said, we were having coffee during the recording session, and Sam said, have you ever thought of Sweeney Todd as a movie? And Sondheim told him, Tim Burton once came to me, but otherwise no one's ever approached me about it directly. And Mendes said, I'd like to do it. Sondheim said, great, let's do it. But the reason in the end Mendes would drop away from the project was, to quote Stephen Sondheim, Sam got frustrated by casting. The people he wanted to cast for some reason or another didn't come through. And so after a couple of years, Sam said, I give up. And he said, I don't know exactly who it was who brought it to Tim Burton and said, are you still interested? But then that's what happened. Because by the early 2000s, Burton was certainly interested again. I mean, he'd just done and not had the best of times, Planet of the Apes with Fox at that point. And it was in the early 2000s where he was rifling through some of his stuff, and he found a drawing he'd done of one of the two main, basically of the two main characters in Sweeney Todd, they being Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett. And he noticed in his drawing the resemblance there was there with two people important to his life. His regular acting collaborator, Johnny Depp, and his then partner, Helena Bonham Carter. And he was struck a bit by the resemblance there. Of course, Tim Burton and Johnny Depp have worked together a lot of times. And so Burton got in touch with the actor. And as he explained to the New York Times in an interview, he gave him the drawings and asked if he'd be interested in taking the lead in Sweeney Todd. Now, Depp was concerned at that stage he wouldn't be able to sing, but Burton was encouraged by the fact that he hadn't actually turned it down, and that was all the encouragement really he needed to pursue the project. And so when Mendes formally dropped out, it went back to Tim Burton, but Tim Burton came to Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, with certain conditions. 1, he wanted to cast Johnny Depp in the lead. 2, he wanted to cast Helena Bonham Carter in the other lead. And these two performers were not noted musical actors. So Stephen Sondheim was going to take some convincing for this, and the convincing took the form of Depp doing an audition for Sondheim in particular, and Bonham Carter recording many takes of her vocal work that were then sent to Stephen Sondheim, and she too got the green light from the composer. Burton also had another condition. He was not going to tone down the blood and the gore of this. That was intrinsic in his eyes, and that meant this film would be an R. That is, it would go out with a rating that didn't encourage youngsters to go along and see it. I mean, under the American rating system, they still could, but let's just gloss over that just for the time being. So could this work? I mean, this was a film, it's been a few years by now since Chicago. It's going to cost about $50 million to make. And in the end, it was a trio of studios that got involved. There was DreamWorks, there was Paramount Pictures, and there was Warner Brothers as well. And between the three of them, they put up the money for this one, and they decided to give it a punt and to go ahead with it. So Burton, in the midst of all of this, was sticking very much to his guns. I mean, he was treating the film like a silent movie with music in it. Peter Lorre, Lon Chaney, classic silent film stars such as they were touch points here. And Burton would also hire production designer Dante Ferretti and give him the brief of not just creating a Victorian London in which to set the film, but a Victorian London with a very tangible horror movie tinge to it, to not resist that, to really lean into it. Now, in one of the earlier iterations of this that Burton had been planning, there was the thought that Sweeney Todd would minimise the amount of set work and instead would rely on CG for its more graphic and gory bits and bobs. But the more Burton got into the planning of the film and putting it together, the less he wanted to rely on computers and the more he wanted to do things physically. As he would tell the New York Times around the release of the movie, he said, this is a musical. And he said, having sets helps you. It helps the actors. It helps the crew get into the right frame of mind. And he said, just having people singing in front of a green screen seemed more disconnected. So there was still the problem, and John Logan had been working on this for some time, on how much do you trim down the musical. So the actual musical itself ran for 3 hours on stage, and the film version was going to have to come in under 2 hours. That meant songs were going to have to be shortened, story elements were going to have to be toned down. Some songs were going to have to be taken out altogether. And whilst that work was ongoing, Tim Burton's involvement was formally announced by DreamWorks in August 2006, with Johnny Depp also announced at the time as the star of the project. This was going to be their next movie once Depp had finished shooting his latest Pirates of the Caribbean sequence. At the same time, it was announced that host narrators would be played by the likes of Anthony Head and Christopher Lee. In October 2006, the confirmation came in that Helena Bonham Carter was on board as well. And then Alan Rickman, Timothy Spall, Sacha Baron Cohen would be signing up by the end of 2006, early 2007 in the case of Timothy Spall. They had to wait for Depp to have finished shooting Pirates of the Caribbean. It was the third one at World's End, although second and third were shot back to back. And while he was filming the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, he would be studying the songs. He'd be preparing for the next film he was going to shoot. Logan continued to trim the script down, to get the musical numbers down as well. But finally, after a lot of vocal training for the cast, a lot of rehearsal as well, filming could begin. And that took place from the 5th of February 2007. Now, Burton was living in the UK around this time, and so the shoot was set in the UK at his choice. A release date was set for the end of the year, though. This was going to be a fairly swift production, but also this was the joy of shooting it practically. It wasn't going to involve extensive post-production work. They knew what they were doing. They were going to be shooting entirely on stages at Pinewood Studios in the UK as well. This wasn't one where they could go out and do location work. You couldn't really go to many locations, dress them up as Victorian London, slash people's throats and have a good sing-song about it. And there are behind-the-scenes photos of the filming of Sweeney Todd with these towering sets dominating the sound stages. Now, there was a problem early in production when Depp had to leave the set for a family emergency involving an illness to his daughter, and that in turn required a reshuffling of the schedule to keep the production going. I should note his daughter was fine in the end. But this reportedly, this reshuffling of the schedule and shooting material that didn't involve Depp at that point also meant that the schedule had to change in other ways too, and was a contributor to the ghost narrator sequences that had been planned being removed, and why you don't see Christopher Lee ultimately in the movie. In fact, Christopher Lee would tell The Telegraph in an interview, he said, "It would have been worse if I'd done the scenes, but I never got to film them." And he said, "It's a shame as the lyrics were wonderful, but these things happen." Now, Lee had done a lot of rehearsal for this, as had Anthony Head. You get a very quick uncredited cameo from Anthony Head in the movie, but originally his role and Christopher Lee's were more extensive. Now, producer Richard Zanuck was overseeing this one, and he did give an interview to Playbill on Broadway, and he just said, "If I'd visited the Sweeney set during production, I'd probably think that I was in a space station." And the reason for that was, in his words, everyone was wearing these suits, and these were astronaut-style suits that they had to wear because, quote, of the blood that was splattering everywhere. And Zanuck would describe, if an additional take was called for, the actors had to change costumes and have their makeup done over because they were doing so much of the blood work, going spoiler light, but, you know, he's the demon Barber of Fleet Street, you can probably work it out. They were doing so much of the blood work with fake movie blood and splattering highly paid actors with all this goo. And so Zanuck explained that Tim Burton had, quote, a very clear plan that he wanted to lift that up into a surreal, almost Kill Bill kind of stylization. That's Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill movies, where the violence and the blood is equally visceral. And Zanuck would describe, he said, "We'd done tests and experiments with the neck slashing, with the blood popping out. And I remember saying to Tim, my God, do we dare do this?" They did dare do this. It would be fair to say there was a lot of red liquid latex on the set of this particular movie. Now, filming would wrap up on May the 11th, 2007. So it was a 3-month shoot. And there was there was post-production work involved in trimming the movie back, as you would expect, that even in post-production, some musical sequences were pulled back. But Stephen Sondheim stayed involved, as he did most recently with the last film he was involved with, Steven Spielberg's take on his musical West Side Story, to which he was close. It was released just after he died. In the case of Sweeney Todd, he'd been present, for instance, for the recording of the film's soundtrack. But one thing Stephen Sondheim was insistent on was he was taking a backwards role when it came to the shoot itself. He was not present on the set of the movie. He wanted to let Tim Burton make his film. It didn't make any sense to him that you just take a stage show and put it on screen. You had to do something with it. So Burton would decamp to New York to edit the movie, and he was up against a deadline of delivering his final cut in mid-November 2007, ahead of a December the 3rd planned release day in New York City, just so that it could start qualifying for awards runs. To Burton's delight, he would describe this as the first film in his career that he didn't actually have to have an audience test screening for. He'd tell Entertainment Weekly about this. The film was screened for the marketing team so they could work out how to sell it. Come into that. But in terms of just putting it in front of audiences to nip and tuck the movie, he didn't actually have to do it. And he would describe to Entertainment Weekly, he said, the studio people realised that the movie is what it is. And he said it's because it's made up of interlocking musical sequences, he said it's not like there's other stuff to cut into it to replace anything. And so then it was the case of, with his cut delivered and with the film heading to cinemas, how do you sell it? And it'd be fair to say that's where things took a bit of a turn. So let's jump to 2 weeks before the release of the movie, with a trailer out there widely playing, TV spots running across US TV, the emphasis firmly on Johnny Depp, then the biggest movie star in the world, really. And so they were selling a Tim Burton film, a Johnny Depp film, and they were forgetting to mention it was a musical. And it got to the point, I mean, this was noticed and people in the know knew it was inspired by a musical. If you'd have come to it absolutely cold, you would have no idea from the promotion for it. It was the word that was missing from the posters. It was missing from the initial raft of trailers and promotional TV spots. And it got to the point where Entertainment Weekly asked the question in an article in its December the 12th, 2007 issue, what kind of movie are they trying to sell? And to quote that, he said, the holiday event of the season. I mean, that was what they were saying. That's what was in the trailer. The holiday event of the season. That's what they were selling. But the singing was being hidden to the point where when the film finally arrived in cinemas and people started belting out tunes within seconds of the film beginning, there was a feeling amongst some members of the audience that they'd been misled by the film. So much so that there were inevitable walkouts and complaints. But famously in the UK in early 2008, complaints went into the Trading Standards Body, to the Advertising Standards Authority as well. And there was just a discomfort and an unhappiness amongst some that the film that they'd been sold was not the film that they ultimately had presented to them. That said, the general critical response to the film was positive. That reviews on the whole, I mean, they were certainly appreciative of Tim Burton's stylised, uncompromising telling of the Sweeney Todd story. It was a film too that ended up on quite a few top 10 lists as well. And the consensus was that this was a pretty good movie. In fact, it would go on to get Oscar nominations as well. That Johnny Depp was nominated for Best Actor, Colleen Atwood was nominated for her costume designs, and Dante Ferretti and Francesca Luciavo would win for their art direction as well. To the delight of the studios involved, though, the film would also find life at the box office too. That it opened in New York for a limited award qualifying release, originally at the start of December 2007. It got its wide release the weekend of December the 21st to the 23rd, and would jump to 5th place at that stage at the box office with a 9.3 million opening weekend. And it was a competitive weekend as well. Lots of big openers that week. National Treasure 2, Book of Secrets, that opened in first place with $44 million. Charlie Wilson's War, which would be the last film from the late Mike Nichols, that was in there at 4th with $9.6 million. Sweeney Todd at 5th. P.S. I Love You sat at 6th. The underrated Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, opened that same week as well. That was in 8th. And the other films that were around, I mean, I Am Legend was in 2nd place in its second week of release. That was doing lots of money. So was the first Alvin and the Chipmunks movie. That was not coming up short financially either. Disney's Delightful Enchanted was in 7th. The Golden Compass movie, coming to that in due course, was in a future episode, was in 9th. Juno was around in 10th as well. And Sweeney Todd, by the end of its US run, would have $52 million in the bank. Beyond that, when it went overseas, in spite of hiding what it was, there was another 100 million in takings waiting for it. And in the end, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, would gross $153 million worldwide. And the long journey of getting the film to the big screen turned out to be a success. The lesson that was taken from marketing departments was a tricky one, really, because you'd have to say in the aftermath of the movie, the idea of obfuscating what your film is has not really gone away. But I do think this remains one of the most standout examples of a studio a little bit scared and a little bit shy of what it was selling. As it turned out, didn't really need to be. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more of my waffle on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get the Film Stories Project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/film stories, and our website filmstories.co.uk is updated every weekday with movie news and features and bits and bobs there. Now, we also do print magazines. I'm a huge believer in print magazines. And there is every 5 weeks or so we have Film Stories magazine. The latest issue is just about to go to print. We also have a magazine for under 15s, younger film fans. I think it's the only regular print magazine of its type, and you can buy copies of those at store.filmstories.co.uk. You can buy individual issues. There's over 40 back issues now, or you can get subscriptions as well. We also have a sneakers Blu-ray with some extras we put together ourselves. It's available in the UK. You can find that at store.filmstories.co.uk as well. But I think I've waffled enough. I think I've bored you enough. As always, I thank you so much for your support and I thank you for listening. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all take care. Bye-bye.